Hi, and welcome to Axel Bank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Alexis Coe, the author of You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. This is her second book, and she is frequently called on to comment on current events from a historical perspective. She's got bylines all over the place. She's also seen on documentaries, including the recent History Channel series on Washington, which she was also a producer on, and she is a museum curator. So thanks so much for being here, Alexis.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure. You have a great Twitter account, and you've certainly carved out quite a niche for yourself. George Washington, who is he? Well, okay, we know he's the first president. He commanded the Revolutionary Army. If we still carried cash, we'd know he's on the dollar bill and the quarter. We also know that he has the most visible monument in Washington. And if you're a bit of a nerd, you know that there are really, really, really long books about him. And many of those books have been written by men. I looked at my own shelf. I've got 14 books about Washington, and 5 of them are written by women. So why has the field of Washington been dominated by men? And why did that have to change?
Well, one, your average is pretty good compared to most people. I'm going to guess those are not biographies, though, by women.
Some of them are, I guess you could say they're about more episodic in history as opposed to full-length cradle-to-grave biographies.
Right. Which I think are, and that is sort of the point is women have been writing about Washington, but they'll write around him. They'll write about his marriage. They'll write about a specific part of his presidency. There are women who are doing great military history. They'll write about, perhaps his early career working for the British. He wanted to be at the center of his country's story, and it didn't really matter which country that was. But in general, women have been excluded from the core of sort of everything to do with history. But with Washington in general, women just haven't written the kind of books that people want to read on Washington. And I don't know if there was a place before mine to write a biography on Washington that wasn't, hagiography or bordering on it.
So how do women write history differently than men?
Women have not had, and when we talk about men, we also have to say, we're talking about a specific kind of man. We're talking about a white man, right? We're not talking, this isn't just like, all the men in America are,
Sure.
We're talking about white men, usually old and usually from the same background. A lot of them come from the East Coast, many from Virginia, and that makes sense. They grew up learning this history, and they're usually preoccupied with honor, and not to say that women aren't. Joanne Freeman, of course, is famously excellent and a leader in that field, but they do tend to be obsessed with masculinity and with the feats of manhood in ways that don't really get us closer to the man. And so when women write history, they do tend to think, okay, I have not, I've had to consider things that white men haven't, right? I've had to consider access and what the world around them looks like that they might not see. And I think when they write history, they write that in.
So one thing we have to talk about here is a term that you have either wittingly or unwittingly coined, and you know where I'm going. Who are the thigh men, and what does that term mean, and why does it come up in Washington biography all the time?
I don't want to date us, but, I usually get a ton of mentions on Twitter about this and emails, and it constantly comes up. The thigh men of dad history is a term
Is that what you call it? Dad history? Dad history? Mm-hmm. Explain
dad
what that
history.
Is also.
I've been talking, dad history, that I did not coin, and I feel like people have talked about that for a while. It's the idea that books are, the traditional definition of dad history is that it is history that dads get on Father's Day. So you don't know what to get your dad, you go to Barnes & Noble and you buy a book off the, table they have that says Father's Day, and what's on that table. It is mostly presidential biographies, perhaps something about Lewis and Clark, something about Lincoln.
Right.
But
The
for the
big
most
Truman
part,
biography, the big
yeah,
Chernow biographies. Yeah, I got it. Okay.
absolutely. And I've been aware of these guys. You have Chernow, you have McCullough, and they dominate. And the thing that I read in Washington biographies. Now, I am the first woman historian in 100 years and the third woman to write a biography on Washington. And so when I said, oh, I bet a lot of those biographies are not by women, I know they're not. And that's
Right.
because
You've looked into this. Yeah.
and I didn't, it sort of came to me, actually. It wasn't a realization I had right away. I was aware of the great man history, but the Simon, I didn't realize no other president has been dominated by men like Washington. And so I knew this, but I didn't quite know the numbers until I was a couple years into it. But the Simon came about as a joke, as a lot of my bad jokes with this book at least ended up becoming true. The title was that as well. The way that the men talked about Washington, they all began the book the same way. All these biographies, which are tomes, they're huge books, which I also just fundamentally disagree with, whether it's this book or my first, or, the one I write next. They start out and they say, Washington is too marble to be real. He's been romanticized, and also we can't look at his flaws. And it's such a problem because we don't have a passionate relationship with him. Say what you will about Jefferson. What I think they're trying to say is, say what you will about Jefferson, people care. They have emotional responses to him. How could he be such a hypocrite? With Washington, you don't get that. They don't really have, you either genuflect in his direction or you don't really have an opinion. You're like, okay, cherry tree, I don't know, whatever. But one of the things that I noticed about their attempts to get us to be closer to him, they would say, okay, I'm going to do this differently, and we're going to know him by the end of the book. But they would proceed in the exact same manner, and that depended on this worship of his body. And his body was amazing, but not for what it looked like, what it survived. However, they spent a lot of time on his body, and I found it to be weird. I would find it weird if they were focusing on a woman, and I think we would have noticed this sooner, because if we talked about a woman's body as being like an amazing specimen that everyone just, the legs really drove them crazy, we wouldn't tolerate it. That would be cancel culture, or at least it would be known.
And if it was part of American history, if it was part of if it was why she became an important person, well, look at her thighs. That would be totally weird.
And I found that it totally, and I think that and it's not that they focused on the thighs more than, I mean, I didn't read a lot about his wrists, for example. I don't know how I felt about his wrists. I know that there were opinions about different parts of his body, but the way in which that they would describe his thighs really, really seemed inappropriate to me. They would talk about the way that he would grip a horse, and that, the way that he moved his thighs. And again, 10 pages later, I don't know anything more about him. I don't feel any closer to him. I would rather know about all the things that he overcame with his body, and how it helped him understand the world, and how it inadvertently put him in situations that he should or should not be in. And so I started calling them the thigh men as a joke, and I, lowercase t, lowercase m. And when you're in graduate school, when you're in college, you read about these terms, these words that people come up with, like great man history, for example, is another way to talk about dad history. And it's the more academic, professional way to talk about it. I never really thought I would coin one. But all my second readers, and my editor, and my husband editor, my husband is an editor, and so I take advantage of that whenever I can. They all ended up capitalizing it and saying, this is a really effective tool. And I thought it was pretty risky.
Yeah,
but
but
I
it's
went with
become a
it.
thing. I mean, it's become like a
Oh,
meme.
it's
It's
become,
become a thing. Yeah,
yeah,
very
even the
much
people who
capitalized.
don't like it, they use it all the time.
Right.
And in the New York Times review, it was one of the reviews. I ended up getting a lot of attention, which was, I am very grateful for. But one of the reviews that I did not expect, because it had been like the third or fourth thing, said, it is, I cringed at it, but it's really good. Like, it gets across the sentiment. And so I would say that is still my daily reaction.
And I do want to proceed with Washington, but have you, and I don't want to put you on the spot. If you don't feel
Mm-hmm.
comfortable answering, please don't. Have you heard from any of the Thigh men?
Yeah.
Oh, you did?
Completely.
Okay. All right. And you don't have
Yes
to
and
name
no.
them, but what was their reaction?
Yes and no. I mean, for one, I worked on the Washington series with Doris Kearns Goodwin, and she blurbed the book, and she very sweetly called me the day it pubbed. And I mention this because she is friends with all of them.
Yeah, right.
She runs in those circles. And so it wasn't, I never went into this thinking, oh, I hope they don't notice. I knew that they would notice. I did not expect for it to get so much attention of all the things. And so when it seemed like, I think after the second or third day after the book had come out and everyone was focusing on Chernow, it started to look as if, and then the Times decided that they would excerpt a part that focused on him. And I thought, it looks like I'm goading him. And that was never my intention. It is fairly standard, as you know, in history books to review historiography, to go over all the people who have come before you and to say, this is what they did, this is where I agree, this is where I disagree. And I say, I think he's a damn fine writer. I really do. I like his books. I've actually finished them. I just have a lot of problems with them if you're taking them at their word. So I wrote him an email, and I simply said that, I have a lot of respect for you.
And you
This
said in
looks
your
a little
book,
skewed.
but you said in your book that you liked the book. I mean, you
Yeah.
said very clearly.
Yeah. I mean, I say what I mean, and I say it in very few words. I say I like his book. I call Washington's treatment of Indians genocide. You just say it, and then it's clear. But it's amazing, even when you're clear, how much is misunderstood. But my understanding is he has received it. We have not spoken, but he acknowledged it to mutuals that it was appreciated.
The intrigue, he was appreciative.
Yeah.
I love the behind the scenes intrigue here of back and forth between historians. So all right, let's proceed with Washington here. One reason I love your book is that it goes beyond the headlines right away. It opens with a table of Washington myths, and it struck me that it's perfectly appropriate that we believe so much baloney about Washington when you look at the fact that the monument to him has no face and no words he left behind unless you get really close to it. So, he's sort of this faceless guy looming over everything, quite literally. So give me some of the myths as part of a larger answer to the question, how did he become so cast in faceless stone?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
I mean, the Washington Monument is so bizarre. It's this phallic,
really
imposing figure. And again, I use phallic I use all these terms because I'm trying to make people see this as not that I am taking the gendered approach, but rather that it has been so gendered and it has done him no favors. And so, how did he become this person? Washington was building the country as he was as he was fighting the war. You know, he doesn't get enough credit for being a statesman. He gets a lot of credit for being the general, and often that's what he's called at Mount Vernon. But he was a person who had qualities that didn't make sense. He did good and bad things, but we don't know a lot about him because we haven't been taught to interact with him in this way. We haven't been given the good with the bad. We've just been given this like story, and so things like the wooden teeth persist. People talk about it even to dismiss it. They'll say, you know, we don't know a lot about him. Wooden teeth obviously isn't true, and then they stop there. But the question is, what were they made of? Why don't we ask that question? And so I wanted to list those myths like wooden teeth, which is a well-known one. And then I also wanted to address things like emancipating his slaves, which is, I think, a bit more for those who know more about Washington. And so this book in general, with the myths and with the charts and the graphs, I wanted it to do everything. You know, I had a lot of goals for this book. And one of them was that it appealed to people who know Washington, who have read a lot of books about him like you, and also people who have read no books about him. And for you, I wanted you to think about this information in a different way than you usually do when you're given it, you know, one bit per chapter of a 700-page book. And for people who don't know Washington, I wanted them to see what they knew and see what they didn't know, and to proceed as if they had read as much as you, as if they knew as much as you. I always assume that everyone is as smart as me. They just don't know everything that I know. And that's what I wanted with the charts and the graphs. And I also did not want a really long book. I am against that fundamentally as even as a reader sometimes, because we've all got busy lives, and sometimes I do really think that it is an ego boost to the author.
And I think some authors can sort of pull it off, but I do agree sometimes. Yeah, some, but I do agree sometimes this could easily be, I sit there thinking this could be 100 pages less or 150 pages less. Let's go back to the beginning. How does a polite, serious son of a single mother, and single mother is so common in our presidential history, how does he go from living on farms to developing this idea that there's a world out there that he can control?
Well, it's interesting. You know, that's another thing that was sort of strange is everyone worked really hard, his biographers, the Thymen, they worked really hard to make it seem like he wasn't really raised by his mother, you know, that he was from the youngest age in opposition to her. Whereas I agree, I feel like being raised by a single mother defined him. It you know, at least it defined his formative years. And we know that both from modern, you know, understandings of how this works, and also from everything that happened to him. Washington was the eldest son from the second family of his father. And when his father died, most of the wealth went to his older brothers. And he very much struggled. But one of those older brothers, Lawrence, was the rich relative. The relative you're supposed to go see in hopes that they'll pay for your schooling, they'll invite you on trips, they'll give you what your parents can't. And for the most part, that worked out as far as exposing Washington to a completely different world full of people who had connections and, in fact, even mandates from the crown. But it also made him feel othered and less, and as if he had sort of been screwed to a certain extent. You know, his story parallels Benedict Arnold in a lot of ways until you get to the war. But he
has a chip on his shoulder at some level. Yeah.
And he says things he shouldn't for a long time. He has a temper he doesn't control, and he's ambitious, as all presidents are, and it is not a bad thing. Certainly I'm ambitious, you're ambitious, but he is reckless with it for a little bit. And it's sort of amazing to read these young Washington stories and see him go, okay, I know what Lawrence, my brother, has. I know what his in-laws have. I want that. I wasn't born into it, so this is how I'm going to get it. And he feels like he's doing everything, right? He takes it really seriously. He goes into every situation wanting to take control, even if he has absolutely no idea how. He's this imposing physical specimen. You know, again, his body is amazing, but because it intimidated people, made people want to follow him, he was charismatic. And he moved with grace. He moved like a football player. You know, you saw him and you thought, okay, I want to follow this guy into war.
And so talk about how he talk about
Yeah.
how he gets mixed up in the French and Indian War, and what does he learn from
Yeah.
this really big mistake? You talk about ambition. He got too ambitious during this war.
Yeah.
Explain what he learns from this big mistake.
So Washington thinks, how can I get ahead? And the way that he can get ahead in this world is, one, by being a surveyor, which his mother helps him do. Against Lawrence, his stepbrother wanted him to do something that might have very well ended his life, which was go into the Navy at a young age at 14. And he says, okay, I want to be a surveyor. And he starts getting all these like good jobs from Lawrence and from his in-laws. And then he ends up finding a way for the other path for people in early America to get rich, to get ahead, which is join the military. Those are the only two ways to be successful. And he ends up getting a commission to go into the Ohio's to basically check everything out from Governor Dinwiddie, great name, which is a royal governor, meaning that America is still the domain of the crown. We're still just subjects of the British. And Washington is in between, right? Because his dad was born, well, not his dad, but he comes from a line of people who were born, in the homeland, and Lawrence, his older brother, was educated there, and he just missed his shot. So he gets this commission based on all that, and he goes and it's partly that it's his hubris. He's a young man, he's not even, age is sort of difficult. If you say someone is 17 now, we think of something really different than we think of back then. But he's a young man, and a combination of listening to the Half King, who has quite a score to settle with the French, who he believed killed his family and removed his father's brains. Misinformation, hubris, all of these things. He ends up, instead of just delivering a message, figuring out, okay, are the French on British territory in the Americas, in the Ohio's? He ends up assassinating a diplomat and starting, basically being a substantial part of the start of the French and Indian War, where we don't really talk about, but is also known as the 7 Years' War. And what I love about that incident, which is a strange way to phrase it, but it tells us so much about Washington, because he writes this letter to Dinwiddie, and he eventually tells him about this, but he spends the first few pages saying, I'm not paid enough, I'm not getting enough respect, because I'm not I'm secondary as a colonist. And then he gets to the assassination, and it's just amazing the priorities. If I screwed up that much in my job, I think I'd lead with that. Really, it's quite a sandwich there.
And this gets a lot of attention. This makes a name for him, and it's sort of the old adage, there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Completely. I mean, think about it, right? I've called it the wilds of the Ohio. I've described that there's like a diplomat, there are French and English forces, and the French, by the way, they're terrible at camping. This is a relevant aside, but I love it. They're carrying like huge pieces of furniture, like wooden furniture, through this. They're carrying it.
See, that's what I would be doing. That's how I camp.
Either making deals with Indians to make them carry it. Yeah, it's glamping, basically.
Right.
No one's that well equipped from this, which is why they need colonists and such, because let's face it, the crown or the French or whoever it is, when I talk about the crown, I'm talking about the British, they're not used to this environment. Someone like Washington is, and he thrives in it.
He's also interested in politics, and he's interested in women. He meets Martha Washington, he meets Martha Custis. How do they meet?
Well, so he's interested in politics, he's interested in women, and he's interested in getting ahead. But all of these things, it doesn't matter what they are. He just wants to be successful. And I think that's really important, because then you understand, wait, how is this guy starting out his military career fighting for the British, and then he's suddenly rebelling against them in a pretty dramatic manner. He wanted to court a lot of women, and they all had something in common, which is that they were rich. And he wanted a lot of roles in politics, in the church, in towns, because again, that's a way to acquire power and prestige. You know, he looks at Lawrence, he looks at all these other men, and he thinks, I want that. I don't ever want to not be able to feed my horse. Because in Virginia, which happened to him as he was raised by a single mother who really did the best that she could in a world that did not want to hear a word she had to say. He was really embarrassed in Virginia. If you couldn't feed your horse, if you were even walked 10 steps, you were nothing. And so he decides, he has a case of dysentery, and that happens to be really good. It's not his first case. It's certainly not his last, but he ends up going to see a doctor, hearing about Martha Washington, Martha Custis at the time, this widow who has it going on. You know, she's got 2 young children, which is a good thing in early America. It shows that you can have children, and also people just sort of, it wasn't as big of a thing in the bloodline. It was great if they came with young children. And she also happens to be in control of a massive estate. Her husband died without a will. He was the only surviving member of his family. Very interesting. His half brother was the result of a master and an enslaved woman, and he was going to get half had he survived, which is so interesting to think of in terms of Martha. He meets Martha. She doesn't need to remarry. As I said, she's got unprecedented power. She's got these young kids. Other people are courting her. She's not interested. But Washington, as you said, had been famous from his diary of that we think failed exhibition, but whatever it was. It was published. She knows about him. She likes what she sees. Her first husband was older. She'd known him her entire life. Washington is her age. She's a little bit older, a few months. And they hit it off, and they hit it off quickly. And we don't really know what happened, because Martha burned their letters, probably at Washington's request. And this was totally normal at the time. But we do know it moved very, very fast. And she was his retirement plan from the British Army, which was not giving Washington the promotions that he wanted, because he was a colonist. He was second class.
So we sort of have a goal. Well, just real quick. So we sort of have this is a crude term that is not respectful, but we sort of have a gold digging war failure walking around here trying to be ambitious. I mean, it's funny how when you change the gender here and you start to think about how would we look at this if it was a modern day woman, those are some of the terms that people might use.
It's a little bit of a grift. It's a little, there's no, absolutely. I mean, that's what I mean. He was ambitious in the way that was almost like FDR's 100 Days. You know, he was throwing things at the wall, and he was just trying to figure out what sticks. He gets to quit his day job. You know, he gets to tell Dinwiddie to shove it. And then he gets to go to Mount Vernon, and he orders from, and this is important, everyone is suddenly happy to open accounts for him or add him to accounts at places that never would have done business with him. And in early America, that's a big deal, because it's just the way it works. It's access. It's exactly as society is now, but it's spelled out far more. And he's really sure that this is the path for him. And we don't see him having any military action, even though he does say that he enjoyed it. He loves he's bent to arms, he says. We don't see that again for quite some time.
When do you think we should talk about slavery more? Is this the best time to talk about it in his life, or is it better to talk about it at the end?
I think it's good to talk about it throughout. And that was sort of really interesting about another thing that I felt was lacking in the biographies of Washington is they tended to have one man with him, William Lee, and they would talk about his treatment of William Lee as if it was emblematic of the hundreds of people he owned, and it was not. And so what I tried to do is, instead of just having a chapter on slavery, a chapter on own a judge, whatever it was, I tried to really make that present throughout the whole book, because that's what Washington saw on a daily basis. And so when we talk about Washington's father dying, in the book I have, well, that means that Washington inherited something. He didn't get what his older brothers got, but he did get slaves. So
What's
from
his
a
view?
very
What's his view of the institution? What do we know about this idea of ownership in other human beings, and of using them to make money, and of managing their families, and of buying and selling, and of punishment? What do we know about all these things?
Well, we know let's go with what Washington did. There are lots of ways we can analyze this. There are lots of ways that we can talk about it, and people have, and we should. But Washington was, when he was out of his mother's house, he didn't emancipate those enslaved people. They had multiplied by then because they had had children. And he continued to buy enslaved people throughout his life. The way other people will tell it who are a little bit more forgiving and who want to whitewash, they'll say, or another way of putting that, a very modern way of younger historians who do this will say, I like to take the good with the bad. It's just a matter of fact that Washington did in fact sell people. They like to say that he didn't, but he did. We know this. It's in his ledgers, and he did it in kind of the worst way possible, because he would say it would be punishment. He wouldn't just sell them to someone. He would say, this person is going to sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and I'm going to tell everyone who is going to interact with him to watch out for him. And you're damning them to death within a couple of years. He is pursuing escaped slaves. Slaves are running away all the time. There is no such thing as a good master, which I've heard actually been asked at Mount Vernon and many other plantation forced labor camps, presidential homes. Washington very much felt there's this very there's an illuminating exchange that he has with Tobias Lear, his secretary, who will marry into his family eventually. But while Washington is the president, he's talking about rotating his enslaved staff outside of his house in Philadelphia back to Mount Vernon, because if he doesn't do that, they will be free, because that's the law in Philadelphia. He's not from Philadelphia. And he says, I want to break the law. He very openly says this because, and he lists all these reasons. And then he says, they're better off under my, care, under what I can provide them, than making their own choices. And we just know that's not true. It doesn't matter if he didn't assault them. We know that he did assault them. It doesn't matter if he fed and clothed them well. We know that he didn't. It doesn't matter if he, agreed they should have families, because he was happy to separate them for years at a time. And in fact, at the end of his life, indefinitely. So when we talk about Washington and slavery, was he raping enslaved women? We don't know, because he was sterile. Was he, was he eager to be, was he an abolitionist? Absolutely not. And so that's Washington and slavery. It's present, it's there, and he very much believes that, Black people are better off being his slaves than they are being free as he is.
And this is certainly going to be something that we talk about as we go on in this episode here, because it comes up again and again. One of the things you write is, first in war does not mean best in war. How does it go as he is picked to lead the Revolutionary Army? These days people tend to think of him as this brilliant military tactician, but as one of your tables clearly points out, he had more losses than wins.
Absolutely. And I have a table, the longest table, I think, in the book, talking about the different battles and breaking it down very, very clearly. This is what happened when, where, who, what, where, when, why. And I do that because I think, all these really long books focus on the battles. They've all done it really, they dominate the book. So I think we're good. There's lots of places for you to find that, but you have all the information. But what I think is really interesting is, first of all, pickings were slim, right? Because when they need someone to be the general, they need someone they can trust. They need someone who looks nothing like a king, which means someone who doesn't have heirs, very convenient for Washington. He has a little bit of military experience, but there are people who have more there. But they have they say things that turn the rest of the founders off. They want to know that their property won't be taken away by the British if we lose. Those sorts of things that don't really inspire a lot of confidence. Whereas Washington is very good at quietly politicking. So what he does is he stuffs himself into this uniform that he hasn't worn in a really long time, since he was a young man. He's in his 40s now. He left the British service in his late 20s. He shows up and he's wearing this uniform. He, as I said, he has the body of an athlete even now. And he goes around to basically every church, every house, shakes every hand, and he is, quote unquote, elected. He's selected in part because he just doesn't run for it. And everyone's really scared of anyone who expresses interest in power. But what comes with that is, someone who's not the greatest, who hasn't been doing this. So he literally goes and picks up books. He does this all along the way, which I do like, but it's also pretty funny. He definitely knows what he doesn't know. And, or as Cheney, I guess, would have said, the known knowns and the unknown knowns.
We don't know. Well, I think that was Rumsfeld, but yes. Okay.
Oh, Rumsfeld. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about Cheney because of what's going on with his daughter and the moment that we're in. But yes. But that's actually while it sounded really dumb and at the time their emotions were high, it's a smart way to go about life, to know that there are things you don't know and to kind of figure it out, at least in broad strokes. And so Washington goes and he picks up these books, and he also surrounds himself with people who seem to be gifted. Hamilton, for example, no one could get him on his staff, as we all know famously from Hamilton the musical. But Washington understood that this guy was a great thinker and he needed him there. And everything he does with the understanding that they will be judged by his actions. And also he's constantly, because he's out to prove something, because he's proving his worth, because he's been othered by the British Empire and now he's taking them on. He doesn't just want to destroy them. He wants to destroy them and look better for it. Everything, he wants to follow rules. He wants to be gracious. He wants to project a certain image, in part to prove something to them, the one that got away, and in part because he really does earnestly want the nation to survive. And I think that did play a part in, not a lot of revolutions work, but ours did pretty well.
At the risk of glossing over big periods of his life here, I want to ask about, of course, his presidency. And one of the things that I've long argued is that he seems to be a better politician than he was a general. And you're arguing that too, that he just understood this was about nation building and this was about how we were going to be seen in the future. And he understood how to campaign for these roles that he wanted. You write that the world had only known kings, despots, and dictators. And he is drafted to be president. He suddenly holds unprecedented authority. You ask, would he transfer? This was the question at the time. Would he transfer power from the military to civilian government, or would he be a new Caesar? So what in him makes him realize, I am not going to be a permanent president. I am going to lead a civilian government, and I will one day hand this over? Where is this in his personality?
When Washington wins the war, and it's not him alone, but when he comes out as this victor, he's done the impossible. He is world famous. He has accomplished his goal, right? Which was, if the British wouldn't make him their number one American, he evicted them. He showed them what they lost. And he's got a wife at home. Those two children I mentioned, who he had raised and cared for really as his own, were both, he had buried them both. And the eldest, Jackie, fairly recently at Yorktown. He showed up for Jackie, whole different story, ne'er-do-well son. There's a generation of them with the founders. And, 2 weeks at Yorktown is all it takes. And then he dies and he leaves behind, again, young children. Martha and Washington are going to raise them. And he loves that. And he's surrounded by kids and he takes it really seriously. And so does she. He has everything that he wants. And he's ready to go home because he also understands that one move in any direction, just an inch, anything that would suggest that he is holding on to power could destroy the nation. And he really does believe in the nation. He doesn't believe in himself as the definition of it. And he in fact says, if everyone depends on me, what happens after I'm gone? It's not going to work. It's the same deal. And so he gives it up quite easily. I mean, right away, as soon as he gets word that negotiations are going well, the Treaty of Paris, et cetera, he, that comes later, but that he understands that peace with the British is close. He writes immediately to Congress and he's like, how do you want to do this? Do you want me to go see you? Do you want me to just send a letter? He signals in every way that he doesn't want power. And he shakes everyone's hand. He gives up his sword famously, shakes everyone's hand, and he just goes. He's home by Christmas. He makes it home in 3 days, which is like as long as it would take him to travel from Annapolis to Mount Vernon. And he's out, man. He's like out.
I'm finished.
Yeah. What does he have left? And and then he thinks he's going to have a nice retirement and focus on Mount Vernon, his real passion in maximizing the enslaved community. And is he incorrect? Because Congress waives, the postage to send him letters. Everyone knows where he lives. They all have his address. It's basically like a Hollywood tour all the time. People are showing up left and right. He builds like a staircase that no one can, so he can go through the back. It's a nightmare. He writes to his mother because she needs a bit of help. And, she's elderly and says like, you don't want to live here. It's miserable. Everyone's always visiting. You always have to dress up, just talk to everyone. And people interpreted that as like, oh, he doesn't want his mother there. He talks about that in other letters too. Like he didn't like it. He wasn't really eager to go back or the constitutional convention's happening. He's like, best of luck with that. But he's also writing letters constantly saying like, what are you guys doing? This is awful. This is against everything that I said. So he's done, but he also, he gave into peer pressure.
Yeah. People say, we need you.
But he needed everyone to say it. He needed everyone to say it. And we know this because later, he was a better politician than he was, I would say, general in some ways, but he had a general sensitivity level, which doesn't work for politics, doesn't transfer. He sort of wanted to allow debate and then say, okay, I made my decision. Everyone respect it, never say a word against it. And that didn't work. But with the lure to the presidency, and he even says he says, I'm going to my execution, I have everything to lose. He does need to be pressured into it by everyone. I believe he does this a couple times, right, where he says like, oh, I couldn't possibly. He definitely, when he went to he became the general, that was an act. He wanted that. But after that, he knew it wasn't going to be good, and he was sort of right.
Yeah, and I feel ridiculous summing up his presidency in one question here, and especially with a question that's about to be as broad as this one is, what is he like as president? We know his first term was better than his second term. He has the Whiskey Rebellion. The cabinet is battling with each other. Just briefly, compare and contrast what he was like as president and what he learns on the job and what he never learns.
Well, so much of it, we discussed before we started recording, I moved this week. And so I've been setting up my office. I've been setting up my home. And a lot of what Washington did when he got to New York, which was the first site, and then to Philadelphia, the second of the presidency, as Washington, Foggy Bottom was being built and planned really at that point. He is just setting up protocol and how things work and who should I hire and how should I work and how do I even enter and who do I go to for advice. He's figuring out things because the Constitution says an awful lot, but doesn't say everything. And he actually annotates it. I love this. They have it at Houghton. John Overholt, another Twitter personality who I've now been working with for a lot, many years, showed me this before I even considered writing this book. And it's Washington's copy. And he says, he writes, president in in the border. So he's really annotating. He's really trying to understand his role, but it's vague, and he does well. And then things like the Whiskey Rebellion, he doesn't. It's definitely executive overreach. He does something good and bad. He's very against parties and partisanship, and so he creates the cabinet. And he fills the cabinet with people who would seemingly be great, right? Like the problem with presidential cabinets now, when we look at something like Trump's cabinet or even with HW or someone, they all agree, they all have the same views, and they don't represent all of America. And not that Washington was interested in anyone who didn't own land and wasn't white, but he knew that Jefferson was brilliant, he knew that Hamilton was brilliant, and he knew that by having them disagree during cabinet meetings, that he would get all the best opinions. So he invents this cabinet, and he lets them duke it out. And Jefferson would later describe this as a cockfight. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, this makes everything so clear to me. A cockfight is one of the most brutal. I've only actually seen bits that I can tolerate, but
it is winners and losers, that's for sure.
It's a fight to the death, and it's brutal, and it's barbaric, and there are no rules, and there are people just surrounding these poor animals, telling them to kill each other. And so Washington in this scenario is presiding over this bloody beaked battle. It doesn't sound very nice to me, but then when it's over, he's like, okay, I'm gonna go with Hamilton. And he goes with Hamilton most of the time, not because he loves Hamilton more, although he does. It's because they're fundamentally, their worldviews are the same. They actually believed in strong central government, a lot of things that Jefferson did not. And so that's where a lot of the missteps happen. Is he can't be criticized. He likes debate, but he doesn't like it to go on past when he says it's okay. Things start to fall apart then, and just like anything else, there's a honeymoon period, and then there's not. And usually for presidents, the first 2 years, if they're ill-equipped, like Harding, for example, or Trump, the first 2 years they can get away with a lot, and then it catches up to them, and they absolutely can't. And for Washington, it's not that policies necessarily, because everything was new, caught up to him, but partisanship and he just didn't have the personality for it. And he was tired and old.
Yeah, especially for that time. One of the things I want to talk about, and this makes him feel really modern to me. As a Jewish person, I just love his letter to a congregation up in Rhode Island. And so I want to ask you about his religious views. He certainly was, I guess for the time, or even maybe for any time, generally, in favor of religious freedom. And I'd like to just ask you about the letter that he wrote and how important that was, and what his own religious views are.
Well, that's such a good question, because it helps me also answer your last question, which is that Washington understood his power as a symbol. He understood that he was internationally famous, but he also knew that the country itself looked to him and imagined him in certain ways. And so even if there's a lot of debate over how religious was Washington, how much did religion play a role in his life, and he just doesn't use certain words and terms that Martha does, for example, or his mother did. These are women who are really devout, or other men that he corresponds with. Even when his son Jackie, who I mentioned, who died, when he writes this sad letter about his sister dying, he writes very different letters to Washington and to Martha. To Martha, it's both parental love. He understands, and as Jackie's saying, as a mother, I'm so sad, and I know how much Patsy meant to you. But his letter to Martha is a lot more religious. Washington didn't talk about meeting up with people in heaven. It just wasn't a priority to him. However, he understood that religious freedom was fundamental, not only to this country, but to a democracy, something that looked different than a monarch, which was so unique at this time. And so Madison, when he came up with the Bill of, Madison really is pushing religious freedom, and he needs Washington's backing, and along with the Bill of Rights. And so Washington throws his weight behind that. And he does that for the congregation in Rhode Island. He does that when Phyllis Wheatley writes him. He understands that his name and his support means something, and that if everyone feels secure in a certain way, that it is harmonious and best for everyone. And that is an example.
Well, go. I was going to say, you don't have to quote the letter. That's, I wouldn't ask you to do that. But what does he say to the congregation in Rhode Island?
He acknowledges their right to practice, and he acknowledges that their religion is, is as important to them as his own is to him, and that it is fundamental in America. And also remember, it's not just a synagogue, it's also Rhode Island. Rhode Island's a bit of a problem. They're so independent, and so all of this is basically, I love that is meaningful to you, and I would love to hear more about it. But to me, all of this is just about saying, hey, everything that we're saying, we really mean.
And also that we're not going to come after you.
No, you will not be persecuted. You will be safe. The white men among you,
Right.
You're fine.
Some of you, yeah, right.
Yeah. When we say, we just have to keep on, and I mention that a lot, because when we all know that ostensibly, intellectually, but when we talk about it so much, it just gets lost.
So, and there are, we could do 10 episodes on George Washington, but I want to ask this question. Should we be proud of him? Does he hold, obviously he holds an incredible place in our idea of what America is. Is that his rightful place? Should we be proud of George Washington?
I think that's a personal choice. I really do. It's such a good question, because it's at the heart of a lot of our conversations about how modern America should look, about our democracy, about the founding era. We know Washington because he's historically significant. And I wrote an op-ed recently for the Post about this, where they asked me to do it. And they asked me, basically, I tweeted something about I don't think people understand the difference between the founders and the Confederates. Washington, if you took down all the monuments, if you took his name off the dollar bill, if you did all of those things, right, it would take a lot of work. We would still know who he is, because he's fundamental to this country. It wouldn't exist without him, both the founding of it and the presidency. Work he did and things we had to undo. It's essential. And when you look at Lincoln refers back to Washington constantly. Everyone talks about the Delaware crossing. Now, that's an important point. If you took down things about Lee and a lot of other minor Confederate generals, there would be a chapter in our textbooks. They would be, a book if you really want to seek it out. But for the most part, a lot of them would fall out of our collective memory, because that's all they did. They didn't do anything else important. So the question of whether they should be heroes, whether we should celebrate them, is a personal one. And it, to me, is not the question we should be asking. The question is not, should we be proud of Washington, but how can we look at him in a way that helps us better understand these conflicts, so that we can understand what's going on right now in our country. Even the founding fathers, even they thought, it's not perfect. You will improve upon this. We don't know everything. And if we would listen to them a little bit more.
And Jefferson was clear about that. Was clear. I guess, so your point is, we should look at Washington in a way that makes us better.
Yeah. Actually, yes, absolutely. And it's hard because it's emotional, right? It's emotional for people who do feel like America is a great country, and our faults are better than others. There's this whole, we know these arguments, and then other people say, this man was a white supremacist, and he built a country that looked like that. He was an enslaved person. He enslaved people, hundreds of people. He did awful things to them. He was a person who would do that, who was and I think both of those things are true. And it doesn't, so for me, it's just not about it's just not
It's
about
not
whether
proud
we
or
can
not
be
proud.
proud. Yeah, it's not.
It's
It's fact, and there are things that I think I'm in awe of. But to me, it's not. I have a professional relationship with him, so I sort of am giving him a bit of a review more than anything else, and not even a review. Just I'm putting together like a case study so that we can. What do you do with a case study? You learn from it.
We talked about his phallic monument.
Mm-hmm.
If you were going to design a new Washington monument, what would it look like?
Oh, yeah. What would it look like? Well, I wouldn't have much of a say in it. I would
No, but
think,
I'm telling you, you
yeah,
have to. You
no,
have to.
no, I know. Well, what I would want to do is I would, as someone who the most recent exhibition I curated was for the ACLU. And it was a traveling exhibition to celebrate their centennial. Before that, the NYPL. And I'm good for that because it's similar to my experience. But I reached out in all of those different jobs. I reached out to people who, again, would know things that I didn't know. And so for the monument, what I would do is I would probably team up with a Black scholar of this era, maybe like Erica Dunbar and I are friends. And so Erica Dunbar, by the way, author of Never Caught, both
Heck of a book.
an adult,
Heck of a good book. Yeah.
An adult version and a young reader's version.
And I have invited her on. I'm hesitant to say this, but I'll say it. I have invited her on and I would love to have her on, but
she's
neither here nor there. Go ahead.
She's lovely. And I'm honored to call her a friend. And she, I would probably team up with her, because we work well together and, for everything that we've just said. And we would come up, I think, with a concept that had Washington, centered in this story, but it would not be, we need to think more flexibly about monuments and what we really are trying to express. And what I would want to express is that it's going to be a busy situation. It's almost like an over decorated living room, because we would need to represent the indigenous people, the enslaved people at Mount Vernon. And then in general, we would have to talk about, I would love to see something that tried to present all the policies and the bills that he signed into law. We've got the bank and we've got the first fugitive slave law. And so we've got all these things. And so I would like to see something that actually taught us something, made us think. And I think that would be wonderful. And that's not far off, by the way. This is basically stealing Frederick Douglass's idea.
Which president deserves a book like this one? Now, I don't want to have you start giving away future projects here, but which president deserves a book like You Never Forget Your First?
I'm afraid to say I think they all do. Presidential biographies have been written a certain way. There's even JFK has so many biographies. There's one coming out.
He deserves a book like this.
He deserves in the fall.
Yeah.
I mean, there's one coming out that I'm curious about. I'm standing in front of my section with presidential biographies, and I'm looking at all of them, and I'm thinking the ones that I think are good are usually written about microhistories, is what I call them. So, I'm looking at Pat and Dick, a book about the Nixons by Will Swift. It's one of the best books I've ever read on the Nixon presidency. It's not about him. So I think basically all of them need a reimagining. I would love to see people of color and more women writing these biographies.
Alexis Coe, author of You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And certainly check out that book and also her Twitter feed at Alexis Coe. She's a dynamo on Twitter. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Be sure to check us out on Twitter and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.